Well, welcome everyone. My name is Franz Hartmann. I'm the coordinator for the Alliance for Livable Ontario. As I noted just a moment ago, please use the chat function to introduce yourself and let people know what part of the province you are in. As you heard, we are recording this presentation and we'll make it available to the Alliance for Livable Ontario website either late this week or early next week. Also, as this webinar goes forward, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, and just put your question in the Q&A and we will get to that. For those of you who are new to Livable Ontario, we are an alliance of people and groups representing hundreds of thousands of Ontarians from many different sectors. We want to build a livable Ontario and stop the provincial government policies that falsely claim they will solve the housing challenges facing us while actually harming our communities and undermining the protection of our farmland, natural areas, and democratic institutions. So before we get into the webinar proper, I do want to make a land acknowledgement. The Alliance for Livable Ontario recognizes that its work and the work of its members take place on traditional Indigenous territories across the province. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties, excuse me, and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work and live in these territories, and we are thankful to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have cared for these territories since time immemorial and who continue to contribute to the strength of Ontario and to all the communities across the province. The Alliance for Livable Ontario is honored to collaborate with Indigenous colleagues, right holders, and communities. Acknowledging traditional Indigenous territories is one way to recognize contemporary and historical Indigenous presence and land rights. It is a small step towards dismantling the continued impacts of colonialism and undoing Indigenous erasure in our everyday lives. Again, welcome to Heading the Wrong Way. This evening, we're going to discuss the proposed Bill 185, the so-called Cutting Red Tape, Build More Homes Act, and the proposed changes to the provincial planning statement, a very powerful law that sets the overall planning directions in the province. As the webinar suggests, these changes, we believe, will do much more harm than good. And to help us understand why, let me introduce our expert guides for this evening. Victor Doyle. From 1988 to 2017, Victor held a variety of senior positions in the Ontario Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, including Manager of Planning for Central Ontario and Lead Planner of the Greenbelt Plan. Many actually say Victor was the architect of the Greenbelt. He is now engaged in advocacy, education, and awareness-raising initiatives related to the ongoing planning of the Greater Golden Horseshoe region. We're also joined by Mark Reusser. Mark farms in New Dundee near Waterloo, Ontario, where he produces turkeys and grows crops. Mark has a BSc in crop science from the University of Guelph and is also a graduate of the Advanced Agricultural Leadership Program. Mark is a director with the Waterloo Federation of Agriculture and the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. And Mark has played a key role in protecting farmland in Waterloo region by promoting urban density. We'll begin with Victor giving us a short overview of Bill 185 and the proposed changes to the Provincial Policy Statement, or PPS, as you'll hear. Then I'm going to ask Mark and Victor a few questions to help focus the discussion and get it going. And then Victor and Mark will answer your questions. So please use the Q&A function to ask your question. If you put them in the chat, I likely will miss them. So use the Q&A function. And finally, we're going to end with actions that each of you can take to help stop these wrong-headed policies. So let me now turn it over to Victor Doyle. Victor.
Thanks, Franz. Maybe you can flip the slide. Well, I'm just going to give you a bit of context. It's all about the land. We call it land use planning. And, you know, this is all we've got. I'm focusing on South Central Ontario here, so we need to use it wisely. And the thing about urbanization, even though we think we're planning for 25 or 30 years, is that it's permanent. Once we've urbanized the landscape, it's not going back. And so we need to think about everything that's going on the landscape. It's not just about housing. Next slide. So the title of the session tonight was Heading the Wrong Way. Well, we're heading the right way. Here's a couple of quotations from two of the most recent groups that have looked at this. On the top right, the Ontario Housing Task Force that the Ford government put together said we need the full spectrum of housing supply, and intensify within our existing built-up areas is the most important thing we can be doing. Over on the left, just a month or so ago, federal task force on housing and climate. Let's focus housing growth in cities and communities. It's faster, less costly, etc. And then just yesterday, or today, I guess, yesterday, quote in the Star from a developer, we should be building housing where we work and play. Next. Well, why should we be developing within our existing communities rather than spreading outwards through a sprawl type of model? You've heard many of these things, certainly starting at the top. Better health, less car dependency and more active transportation and transit leads to better health, way lower healthcare costs. We've got dramatic increases in chronic diseases from sitting around too much. We get better protection of our water quality and quantity, and our conservation authorities have shown us that where we urbanize, the quality and quantity of groundwater and surface water is poor to very poor. It's striking. Farmland, we've lost 60% of our farmland in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, 40% Ontario-wide, and we're losing 319 acres a day, according to the 2021 census. 319 acres a day, wow. And certainly our natural heritage, the less we build out, the more we can protect and get all the ecological goods and services that nature provides for free. These things are worth billions and billions of dollars. And on the flip side, we know sprawl doesn't pay for itself. It leads to this structural infrastructure deficit. There's just too many linear facilities in terms of roads and pipes and sidewalks and curbs, et cetera. In terms of gridlock, we're never going to build our way out of it through highways. It's impossible. And gridlock is costing us upwards of $10 billion a year now. And certainly from a climate perspective, we know more compact urban form uses less energy and gives off less greenhouse gas emissions. And because the government's so focused on housing, and what those two task forces that focused on housing said is, building inwards lets us build more of the type of housing in the locations and the housing types that people need and can afford. Next, please. But the government hasn't been really listening. And while they released some rhetoric and platitudes about building inwards, and they've done a few things, the vast majority of their policy framework and legislative framework agenda has been the opposite. And just moving through a few of these quickly, environmental protection, you can go down that column. They're doing so much damage to our environmental laws and policies, from conservation authorities to wetlands to endangered species. In terms of farmland protection, they're reducing all the requirements we had to promote more intensive growth in our communities and more dense growth where we were developing on green fields. And they're pushing out our planning to the middle of the century based on old ways of doing things. They took land from the green belt and they're proposing to get rid of the growth plan. And you know what they're going to service it by? Highways. You've all heard about the 413 and Bradford bypass. And they're doing this in part by removing municipal council's decisions and those of their elected representatives. Whether it's before the Ontario Land Tribunal, or abolishing regional planning, or imposing urban boundary expansions on municipalities. The list goes on and on. And these are just a few samples. And then for citizens, they're basically kicking us out. They're saying citizens can't participate at the tribunal in certain instances, or the environmental assessment process. And they're going to strong mayors where only a third of council can pass bylaws while the minister sits around and imposes minister zoning orders, which have no public participation at all. And a lot of these changes are actually to facilitate these highways that they're so keen on. Next slide. And these are all things they've done already. And it's important to understand that Bill 185 and the new PPS build on all these years of regressive policies and legislative backsliding. And it's not theoretical. All those colored lands you see, except for yellow, well, the green is the green belt, all the purples and pinks, whatever, those are lands approved for urbanization. In the Greater Toronto area alone, they've added about 50 to 60 or more thousand acres just over the last couple of years on top of what we had already, which amounts to about 120 or 30,000 acres. There is so much land they're approving for urbanization. It's just remarkable in a bad way. Next. And so what are some of the things they've actually done in Bill 185? Well, they set the stage now for the formal repeal of the growth plan. It was supposed to be integrated with the new provincial policy statement, but there's virtually none of the requirements and policy frameworks or vision of the growth plan included in the PPS. And so I'm going to use the next couple of maps, Franz, to elaborate a little bit. So next slide. So this is a map of the growth plan. It was an award-winning plan from 2006, and it was to work with, you'll see in the right corner, the big move, which was the regional transportation plan, a $60 billion, primarily transit-based plan to help accommodate all the growth we were going to see in the region. So the growth plan and transportation plan went hand in glove. And next slide. And the growth plan and the Greenbelt plan went hand in glove. Growth plan was how to accommodate urbanization, the millions of people coming here in the most efficient way while reducing the conversion of farmland. The Greenbelt was to protect farmland and natural areas and where urbanization wasn't to occur. Next slide. In 2017, the growth plan was amended to add a natural heritage system for the entire Greater Golden Horseshoe. And next slide. Sorry, it's a bit blurry, but all the brown is an agricultural system. This was to protect the natural features and water and farmland beyond the Greenbelt, because the Greenbelt only covers 20% of the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And so we had a really robust, comprehensive approach. Next slide. And yet today, and shortly, all we're going to be left with is the Greenbelt itself, because the next slide shows, well, it's supposed to be a blank slide. Franz might have deleted it thinking I put it in by error, but it was white. The slide was white because there is nothing left. There is no provincial growth management framework for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which is one of the biggest city regions, fastest growing city regions in North America. It's gone, the whole growth management framework, the provincial one. And so they didn't stop there. Let's get the province out of the way to allow low density residential sprawl and other forms of it. But let's get rid of the regions and upper tiers as well. And so Bill 185 formally removes the planning authority from York, Peel, and Halton regions, which was announced through Bill 23 a couple of year and a half ago. And it sets the stage for Durham, Waterloo, Niagara, and Simcoe County to follow. So virtually all the big regional and upper tier governments no longer will have a role in planning. It also prohibits these upper tiers from appealing lower tier municipal planning documents, official plan, zoning bylaws to the Ontario Land Tribunal. Despite the fact that these upper tiers still have jurisdiction over sewer and water, major roads and transit, social housing, emergency services, public health, and a number of other things. Next slide. I did a little presentation to the Standing Committee on Regional Government. The top image is the 21 upper and single tiers in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. With the abolishment of planning by the upper tiers, the 13 of them, the counties and regions, it's going to devolve to the lower map. 89 lower tiers, primarily rural in nature, with very little capacity and no jurisdiction over any of those main issues, are going to be leading all the growth management planning for the entire region. No province, no regions or upper tiers. Next slide. So the other big thing that Bill 185 and particularly the provincial policy statement deals with abandoning the settlement expansion policies. We used to have a pretty rigorous framework in the growth plan and the provincial policy statement, but now I'm just showing you some highlights here. There's no more intensification targets. They're encouraged only. So municipalities can just make up whatever number they want and even apply. They don't even have to apply. It's just best efforts. Same with greenfield density targets. With the exception of these 29 large and fastest growing municipalities, there's a target of 50. But again, it's only encouraged. And for the rest of the 80 or 90 municipalities in the Golden Horseshoe, there are no greenfield density targets, which is how you reduce the footprint of urbanization where we are expanding outwards. It tells every municipality they have to basically plan for 25 years, and they can go up to 30, which is an increase from previously. And there's no requirements to map agricultural or natural heritage systems. It's just do your best. Next slide. It doesn't stop there. They're now saying that a municipality, the lower tiers, can have a settlement expansion anytime they want, that there's no requirement to do any comprehensive analysis to justify why you need it. It's sort of best efforts again. It removes the requirement for municipalities to even speak to, or for municipalities to require developers to speak to them about potential settlement expansions if they don't want to. And it allows new settlement areas as if we don't have enough and enough trouble trying to service those. Next slide. And one of the pieces that I find really egregious and an affront to planning is that they're now prohibiting, through Bill 185, third party, which is citizen, landowner, environmental organization, other organization appeals of municipal official plans and zoning bylaws. And for settlement expansions, developers used to not be able to appeal for a settlement expansion application if a council didn't want to support it, but now they can. And so effectively, with cutting out the citizens and allowing developers to appeal settlement expansions, the Ontario Land Tribunal is becoming a developers only tribunal, which is supposed to be a court of justice, but when it's focused on one group only, it makes it very difficult to see how they're going to do that role. And you know what? Planning, public participation is central to planning, and to not allow the public to take issue with municipal official plans and zoning bylaws, especially under these really lax new rules, is really bad policy and law in my view. And it's not just housing. Think of gravel pits. or big new golf courses, or any other kind of land use, you will no longer be able to appeal. Next. And as if it wasn't enough to allow settlement expansions, laissez-faire pretty much. The first bullet's a bit of an error, but basically they're now allowing residential subdivisions again throughout the greater Golden Horseshoe. The growth plan prohibited them since 2005, but now you're going to see them allowed again. And to help that, they've made the servicing provisions more flexible, because typically out in the countryside, there isn't a lot of pipes to hook things up to. So we're going to see more sort of septic and private wells or partial sewer and water services, which aren't good. And they're allowing 2 additional residential units on every farm to help support the housing of farm help. And we can talk about that more later. Next, please. So focusing on housing, because all the regressive steps the government has taken has been to support housing for 5 million people coming here over the next 30 years, while dismantling all the environmental and agricultural policies we've had to ensure we do that in a environmentally and fiscally sustainable way. And so even though housing is supposed to be the focus, the government did not allow 4 units per parcel. They allowed 3 a year or so ago, but they won't go to 4. Oh, back up 1, please. And even in the PPS, what I've summarized there is the housing policies. That's it. They're all just sort of promotional. They don't require anything. They don't talk specifically about how much or where or the types. Next. They did do a few things in Bill 185 or accompanying it, and that was proposals to amend the building code to allow a single stairway for small residential buildings, which might help make them more economical. And they're proposing to potentially exempt additional units from some zoning requirements. Next. Oh, that's a bit of a repeat, so keep going. I think we can skip this one too, Franz. And financing, I'll skip to, although I should, we'll talk about the development charge world, I think, later on in the question and answer period. But my take is Bill 185 and the proposed PPS do very little to deliver housing, let alone affordable housing. And they represent the next phase, or hopefully a culmination of the strategic effort to promote sprawl. And last slide. This isn't coincidence. This is all a very systematic, thoughtful dismantling of how we've done things for 2 generations. And it starts with getting the province out of planning at the Golden Horseshoe level. We then get the regions and counties out of the picture and turn it over to the local councils, where development industry holds a lot more sway because the regions and upper tiers aren't there. It's served by pushing these 400 series highways and then eliminating all the environmental laws to facilitate those highways and allow more urban development out on the landscape. And they're taking us out in terms of citizens out of the picture, because we might rise up and say, don't do any of that. And they're doing the same with municipalities by overriding their decision making. And particularly through the strong mayor powers, where only 1/3 of council is needed to pass planning bylaws. And they're pushing in the strong mayors to use these powers through intimidation in terms of holding back funding, penalizing, or incenting them by giving them funding to do all of this stuff. So that's my summary of Bill 185 and the PPS 2024.
Well, thank you very much, Victor, for a comprehensive but also concise overview of not just Bill 185 and the changes to the provincial policy statement, but the overarching strategy behind this. If you've got questions coming out of Victor's presentation, please put them in the Q&A feature and we'll get to them in a short while. Okay, let me bring Mark Reusser into the discussion. Mark, you've heard Victor, you have read a lot about this stuff. You've had lots of conversations with farmers, not just in your neck of the woods, but probably across the province. What are your biggest fears if these changes that Victor talked about actually become law?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Victor for his summary. It was great. And thank you, Franz, for facilitating this. I'd like to express my fears by telling a story from a Waterloo perspective, because that's where I'm from. So 50 years ago, in 1973, we decided as a community that we would do a couple of things, recognizing that we had an industrious, innovative, dynamic, livable urban area surrounded by an equally industrious, thriving, rural, agricultural countryside. And the issue was, how do you support both? So we entered into a kind of, I call it a grand experiment. How are we going to do this? Because they're both good and they're both valuable and they're both worthwhile. So we instituted visionary planning at the regional level, the upper tier level. And by visionary, I mean planning for not just today and tomorrow, but planning forever. We instituted mandatory intensification. We instituted mandatory higher densities on greenfield development. We instituted designated growth areas in the serviced areas of the township. So only the places that had municipal services could grow. No one else could. We instituted countryside lines, hard urban boundaries, with the intention that we would never, ever reach those boundaries. We would continue to intensify and never, ever get there. So in a sense, they were meant to be permanent. We instituted environmentally sensitive landscape designations to protect the headwaters of our cold water creeks and rivers. We instituted a protected countryside designation to protect our moraine and the aquifer that lies beneath it, because that's where we get our water. We instituted a no severance policy since 1973, not even for surplus dwelling residents in the countryside, to eliminate scattered rural development, which is the enemy of agriculture. And finally, we instituted something called the Waterloo Regional Water Quality Program, which was meant to protect the flowing waters of our and the aquifer in our community. And that was a partnership between the region, Grand River Conservation Authority, and agriculture. So having done all of those things, was it a success? I would say just look at Waterloo. It's probably the most innovative, dynamic city in North America. It works. We've also protected our countryside. We have the highest income per acre and the highest income per farm of any county in Ontario. That's a fact. And that didn't happen by chance. That happened because we planned for it. So I would postulate that Waterloo region and our planning, our visionary planning, is actually a template for the rest of Ontario. It's not something to be blown up. It's something to be copied. And my fear is that it's being blown up. Everything we've done and planned for in the last 50 years is potentially gone with this legislation. And I think that's a tragedy for not only us in Waterloo, it's a tragedy for everyone in Ontario, because we'll all encounter the same issues. And that's sad, and that's what I'm scared of.
Okay. Victor, same question to you. I know you've kind of touched on this, but maybe you could just summarize it in, a short number of sentences. What are your biggest fears if these changes become law?
I think one of my biggest fears is it's going to be hard to recoup the lost ground. There's been a lot of change, negative change thus far. And even if a new government of any stripe is elected, a more enlightened conservative leader even, there's been so much change, it'll be hard to bring it all back. But I'm a planner, and so I'm a glass half full guy, and I'm confident that we're going to see sanity prevail at some point and reclaim some of the lost ground.
Okay. So I'll send this to both of you, but we'll start with Mark. I mean, to state the obvious, we're in a housing crisis. I doubt there is anyone on this call, and there's lots of us on this call, who don't have a personal story about someone we know, if not a family member, who's having problems finding a place to live that's affordable. It doesn't matter if they're a renter or an owner. What impact do you think these changes have been put forward by the provincial government as, well, this is how we're going to solve the housing crisis? What do you think, Mark, about these changes? Do you think that they're actually going to lead to building the housing we need?
I don't think so, and I'll repeat some of what Victor already said. I don't think this legislation will build one more house, and it won't build one more house faster, but it will build a lot of houses that are expensive in the wrong places. And that is also a tragedy, because that means we lose farmland. That means we lose environmentally sensitive land. And we build places that we permanently remove the ability to grow food for the people that live here.
Yeah. And Victor, I know you kind of touched on this, but I'll dig a bit deeper. So what are the consequences for the housing crisis when we have builders and developers and municipalities focusing on building housing on green fields and adding farmland and natural areas into the urban boundary? What are the consequences on getting the housing we need built when that's happening?
Yeah, thanks, Franz. Approach it with a couple of facts to start. Last year in Ontario, 2023, only 20% of all the housing starts in Ontario were single detached houses throughout the entirety of the province. And today, or last year, I guess, 50% of all households are 1 and 2 person households. The demographics are changing. In the 1970s, our average family size was like 7 people per house. And if you look at income, you know, the vast majority of households simply could never afford a single detached house at today's prices. And so the Premier and the government at large espouse a lot of rhetoric about, you know, supporting intensification, but it's sort of hollow talk, primarily because you've heard the Premier also say he's not even going to support fourplexes. He's going to focus on single detached housing. That's a quote. Well, single detached housing doesn't meet the 1 and 2 person household needs, the income that households make. I'm not even talking about all the environmental and agricultural and other gridlock issues that I mentioned at first. So really, to achieve our housing goals, we need to focus on building within our communities and not just tall 1-bedroom condos, that missing middle, gentle density, some bigger stuff around transit stations, a lot of medium density along our main streets and bus routes. And that's what these 2 big task forces just recommended over the last 2 years. And they were multi-sector with people from every discipline, including the development and financial sectors. So it's like that information is just going past the government's ear, and they're focusing again on greenfield, low density housing, which it will not get us to where we need to get to.
Yeah. And just a personal example, where I live downtown Toronto, we got rid of our garage and built a laneway house. And, you know, we were fortunate to find builders who were ready to do that. But I just fear what happens if those builders are building McMansions often on farmland, right? they're not building the sort of housing we need. So that to me is a personal scary thing. Okay, so I'm going to a couple more or one question more to each of you. I suspect we have a lot of councillors and perhaps even mayors and perhaps some municipal staff joining us this evening. And I also know that Mark, you and Victor constantly talk to councillors and mayors and city staff. What would you advise them to do if these changes actually become law? I'll start with you, Mark.
I guess I would recommend that they push back. And I'd say to them, pull out a map of Ontario and look at it. Only 5% of Ontario's landmass is suitable for growing food. Only 5%. And we live here. Think of the future, and think of the future for your children and your children's children. Do you want to be able to produce food in this province? Do you want to be self-sufficient? We're not self-sufficient currently. We're only getting worse. And I'd say, look at this place in the context of North America. Southwestern Ontario is this wonderful Goldilocks zone with moderate climate, wonderful soils, moderated by 3 Great Lakes. We can grow a longer list of fruits and vegetables and grains than any other location in North America, with the exception of California, which is dependent on water from somewhere else. Why in the world would you even contemplate sacrificing that for housing or business when there are suitable alternatives galore? I think it's a shame. I think that I would say to them, hey, give your head a shake. Think of the future. You're part of the future. You don't want to be complicit with destroying what is good.
And Victor, what would you say to municipal councillors and municipal staff? Well, how would you advise them if these changes become law?
Well, some of them have become law, so maybe 3 points. I would really caution mayors from utilizing strong mayor powers when it comes to making planning decisions, let alone other things, but I'm focusing on planning. Secondly, there has been a lot of urban expansion approved and expansion of towns and villages across Ontario and up in Ottawa and everywhere. It's so important to take the time to plan that land in the most forward-looking way. Don't look backwards over the last 30 years and try and extrapolate that. We need to embrace a much different model of how we design greenfield communities. Thirdly, I would say you really need to embrace intensification. And if you want some examples, go to Waterloo and some of the stuff they've done. They are one of the leading jurisdictions. And fourthly, I would say take the time to ask staff to put together the types of information you need on the cost of different forms of development, on some of the things I talked about in terms of greenhouse and climate change and how your watershed is functioning and things like that. So there's some of my key messages.
Great. If I could add just one thing, Franz, if that's okay, and that is to highlight something that Victor just said. And that is, based on my experience, continuing experience here in Waterloo, the need for government to be open, transparent, and collaborative, and look at all alternatives. When you do those things, you arrive at a better conclusion and you make a better decision. I think that government done in secret, behind closed doors, with people signing non-disclosure agreements, is what makes us as citizens mad, and it breeds disrespect for the institution of government, and you should stop it.
So before we turn to your questions, and we've got a whole bunch of them, thank you. Keep them coming. We'll try to get to them as many of them as we can. I want to introduce a wee bit of hope into this webinar. I want to let you know that Livable Ontario has actually created a letter to the Premier and other members of the Ontario Legislature asking them to not proceed with Bill 185 and the proposed changes to the public policy or provincial policy statement. We've just started asking organizations and individuals across Ontario to endorse the letter. And now I'm actually asking you to consider endorsing this letter. I've just put the link to our website where you can find this in the chat function. So either now or just open this up, and after the webinar, please consider endorsing the letter that we're sending to the Premier and to other members of the legislature saying do not proceed with these very, very bad actions. Okay, now to your questions. Lots of them here. The first couple actually are very similar. And I'm just going to throw them out, and I'll let both of you, Mark and Victor, answer them if you want to. Question from Sylvia: have the regional and upper tier governments responded to this? Where are they on this? Do they support these the changes in the bill?
You go ahead, Mark.
Deafening silence. Surprises me, having worked with my regional government for 30 years, to hear that silence. And there must be something that they're concerned about that prevents them from speaking openly. For goodness sakes, municipalities are creatures of the provincial government. The provincial government has all the power. It's sad to see the little power that municipalities have, upper tier, being taken away from them.
Just to add to that, Franz, I saw the vice president, I think is the right word, of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario speak at a public forum saying municipalities are scared. They don't want to speak out because they're afraid they're going to be punished or have funding withheld of some sort by the government. They call it a punitive government, and they're scared to speak out.
Yeah.
And having said that, appearing at the regional or the standing committee on region upper tier government, the CAO of Simcoe County was very forceful that he thought it was wrong and the upper tiers should be maintained and given more authority to engage in growth management and resource management, farm, natural heritage, water.
Okay. Andrew writes, fabulous slides. Victor, can they be made available? Yes, we will get these. These will be posted on the Livable Ontario website along with a link to this webinar. Just stay tuned. Peter writes, directing development to existing cities and towns to prevent urban sprawl, totally agree. However, it seems vertical density beyond the height of the missing middle in transactional cities like Toronto increases gridlock and doesn't provide for healthy community living, where public transit and soft infrastructure, culturally sensitive community centers, and green spaces are sadly lacking. Can you detail the towns and cities that would benefit and be able to support the housing we all know is needed? I guess just to summarize, there's another extreme that you see in existing towns and cities where you have these huge high rises. What's the sweet spot?
Want me to try that, Franz? So I think while one can advocate for density, one needs to make sure that that density is put in the right place. And there are places for very tall buildings, and there are places where very tall buildings shouldn't be. The same with the missing middle and single family. Do them in the right place. And when you do them, make sure that they conform to your official plan. Because if there's one thing that detracts from support for density, it's locating a building in an area that's zoned for 20 stories and making it 50. Again, that breeds disrespect for government. It also says, do your planning well. Ensure that the places where high density should be, it's allowed. transit nodes and transit corridors and highways and so on, where it's in the right place, not the wrong place. And also be careful to say that no one wants to live in a tall building, because there is a demographic that does want to live in tall buildings, as there is a demographic for those who want to live in other places too.
A couple of points on that as well, Franz. I think we all agree if we're going to intensify, we need the community facilities and the parkland, both green and less green. And you know what? The government has actually been, where municipalities like in York Region and Toronto have been really supporting intensification, they've been overriding their official plan, saying you can't link it to any of these things. You can't, they're even overriding their requirements to have some of these units be affordable units. So the government's kind of talking out of both sides of its mouth. And, but I agree totally with Mark. We need a range of housing types. And if we tie it to those important community pieces, we can have tall buildings. Where I live, there's lots of 4, 6, 8-story stuff along the bus route, and the gentle density throughout much more of the existing areas. I think you need all those.
I think you also should refrain from planning for a building, and a building of any size. Rather, you should plan to build communities and neighborhoods.
Okay, Dean writes, maybe, or asks, maybe the most obvious question is where are these awful, unsustainable sprawl policies coming from? Is the province that incompetent, or developers asking for it? Are the margins on building low density homes that much better? Maybe I'll have send this to Victor for starters, and then you, Mark.
Yeah, so my own view, and I've written several papers on this, most recently in an article in Plan Canada last September. These changes are all being driven by the development sector, or elements of it, I framed it. And they're doing it because the revenue or the profits from converting farmland to urban are massive. The amount of money that's made the minute the minister signs on the line that this land is now urban is astronomical, far greater than building the profit from building houses. And it's easier for the big greenfield developers to do, although most of them have urban divisions now as well. Because there's no citizens typically out in the greenfields opposing them like there might be in some of the cities and towns. So that's where it's all coming from. And it's been a 10-year strategic effort by industry to basically convert the government to its way of thinking. And government's proven that it's beholden to the development sector. And you've seen this in some of the corrupt deals and scandals that we've seen.
I agree with Victor, but I would add a caution to that and refrain from tarnishing the entire development industry with the same brush. There are some very good, some very innovative developers who build some beautiful buildings in beautiful neighborhoods that are high density. And I think we need to praise those that do it well and reward them.
And just, that's why I said elements, Mark, because I totally agree. There's lots of really progressive developers. But those seeking the greenfield urban expansion have been driving this bus. There's no question.
Okay, Helen writes, could rural municipalities organize some joint planning function to take advantage of the expertise, which is all going to be eliminated at current upper tiers, especially in Simcoe County, which is substantially rural and whose lower tiers are under serious pressure for sprawl development? In other words, if I'm paraphrasing Helen, could rural municipalities come together and kind of reproduce an upper tier approach, or is that just wishful thinking? And I'll send that to you, Victor.
Well, certainly that's a model moving forward. It would be less successful than a more formalized model of upper tier. But I heard Niagara region municipalities were thinking and talking along those lines. And I've heard one of the conservation authorities, who I won't out, also talking along those lines, given the restrictions the province has placed on them. So people are looking at workarounds to try and recoup some of the lost ground.
Okay. And Mark, a question for you. Or sorry, did you want to say something?
I'll just finish off if I could. In answer to the question, one of the great things about two-tier government is that the upper tier had the luxury and the funds to do visionary planning. Often the lower tier is simply forced to do what they have to do at any given moment. It actually works for both sizes of government. You leave the visionary part to the upper tier and let the lower tier do what they have to do and support them. Can rural municipalities who don't have the resources to do good planning band together to do it? I think that would be great if they could do that. One of the greatest resources of Waterloo in the past has been the ability to hire visionary planners. For goodness sakes, these are the people we depend on to plan for our future and our children's future.
Just another point on that, Franz, is that I can see and Simcoe County doesn't have control over sewer and water, but because all the other regional governments do and will continue to, they own hundreds of billions of dollars of transportation and sewer and water infrastructure that is not migrating to the lower tier. And I can see them using their jurisdiction on sewer and water in particular to try and achieve some of the lost powers in terms of regional growth management.
So Mark, a question I think straight to you from Sylvia. And I'll preface it by saying, we're all very aware of the climate crisis and how, we seem to have these severe weather events, including droughts. With that, what are the implications on our future food availability, given what Bill 185 and the PPS are going to do?
Well, the most obvious one would be the loss of productive farmland. Yeah. I think also there's an issue with scattered rural development. It isolates and it sterilizes a good portion of the farmland surrounding it, and that's unfortunate. One of the mechanisms that we used in the past to prevent that was minimum distance separation formulas, and with the loss of third-party appeals, MDS, the value of it will be severely diminished. That's what protected farmland. That would be my short answer.
Right. Okay. Somebody asked who set up the housing task force. I can answer that quickly. The provincial government did back in 2019, Victor, maybe 2020, but that was done by the province. Sharon asked, for Victor, do you think removing the planning function of upper tier governments is the first step in dismantling regional governments?
Well, that's a good question. My testimony at the standing committee was, whatever you do, do not dismantle upper tiers. And I don't see it happening because of the hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure they own and operate and have all the expertise, and that simply the lower tiers could not do it. But also, I think we see some writing on the wall when the government reversed the dissolution of Peel Region. So I'm hopeful that's not going to occur.
Yeah. Jane writes, are the professional urban planners in the municipalities collectively pushing back? If not, why not? What about the treasurers, since this is a recipe for falling further behind in terms of funding infrastructure and operating expenses?
Well, I've followed all the initiatives. This current batch, Bill 185 and PPS 2024, is the 5th housing action plan. And I followed a lot of the submissions, and there is a pushback across the board on many of these regressive approaches. The government simply does not listen. They've only reversed course on maybe 5 or less of these big things. including allowing 2 or 3 new lots to be severed off every farm for a house, Mark. And there was a question about that in the chat. They've walked that back and now they're proposing to allow 2 additional residences per farm, provided there's no severance of those houses allowed, and they have to be kept tight to the farm cluster to even reduce the potential for someone to seek a severance down the road. So lots of pushback. My own professional planning institute has been weak, very weak. The engineers even came out against 413, but the planners were meekly silent, basically. Very disappointing.
I would just add that with the constant churn and change in legislation, it makes the job of a planner very hard, especially if you're a visionary planner. How do you do it when the rules keep changing?
Yeah.
It's really tough.
You know, one of the silver linings, if I could call it that, is as the regions are losing their planning authority, a lot of really experienced, smart, progressive planners are moving to lower tier municipalities and to the private sector, where I think they'll bring a refreshing, not refreshing, but additional in-depth sort of life experience to that.
So we're coming up to the top of the hour, and there are a number of more questions, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. Some of them are very specific. I invite everyone, if you have a question that you want to get to Mark and Victor that hasn't been answered, feel free to email me at info@livableontario.ca, and I will forward it to Victor and Mark, and we'll do our best to get answers to you. But there have been a number of questions, all kind of focusing around the same thing, and that is, so what do we do? I just want to read a comment Dean made for you, Mark. Mark, is it time for a tractor rally at Queen's Park? While the OFA has been trying very hard to work with the province, it seems like we are losing ground despite our best efforts. What will get the province's attention? I'm not going to put you on the spot right now about whether or not you think that's a good idea, but I will say that one of the big lessons that I learned from the Greenbelt reversal that happened is that, you know, as I think many of you on this webinar know, that happened because there was huge pushback from the public. And I just want to reiterate again that one way to develop that pushback is by getting people to sign on to this letter that the Alliance for Livable Ontario has created. I've just put the link again in the chat. This is how we build momentum. And I think one of the ways we do that is by talking to people about this, talking to your neighbors, talking to your colleagues, and calling your elected officials, your councillors, mayor, MPPs, even your MP, and letting them know you are unhappy about this direction. If you do that, if your neighbor does that, if your friends do that, that's how we build opposition against this. On one hand, it seems very simple. On the other hand, it's actually extremely powerful, because politicians ultimately listen to constituents, because we're the ones that are going to elect them or unelect them if they don't listen to what we're doing. So with that, I want to thank all of you for the great questions. Thank you, Victor and Mark, for your great insights and wisdom. They were very helpful. As I said, all of this information will be made available on the Alliance for Livable Ontario website in the coming days. I urge you to visit the Alliance website right now for 2 reasons, actually. First of all, to sign that, to look at that letter and endorse it if you think it speaks to you. And secondly, if you like this webinar and you like the work that the Alliance for Livable Ontario is doing, please help us do more of this. Please make a donation right now. If you go to our website and hit the donate button at the top right corner, it's going to take you to the Small Change Fund. That's the partner that we work with. They're a charitable partner, and your donation will get you a charitable tax receipt. And most importantly, it will ensure we can continue the efforts like this to help build a livable Ontario. Finally, this recording, as I said, will be made available. I will send a link out to all of you who registered, which of course is everybody here on this call. And I want to end by saying, have hope. I know that Mark and Victor kind of rightly said, yep, there is some bad stuff coming down the pike, but it doesn't have to happen. And even if it does happen, it can be turned around. It won't be easy, but we can do it by working together and by having one voice. With that, I thank you all again for attending this evening. Thank you, Mark and Victor, and I wish you a good night. And please support our work and endorse her letter. Good night, everyone. Thank you.